Hello, and welcome to Grey.com Talks With. Today, we're talking with Jason Rylander, Senior Endangered Species Counsel at Defenders of Wildlife, an organization dedicated to the protection of all native animals and plants in their natural communities. And if you're new to our podcast, please press subscribe button either on YouTube or your podcast app, because today we're going to learn about an organization that is protecting and restoring imperiled species throughout North America by transforming policies and institutions and promoting innovative solutions. Hello, Jason. Welcome to Grey.com Talks. We're excited to have you here.
I'm delighted to be with you.
Wonderful. Could you please describe Defenders of Wildlife for someone who is not familiar with your work?
Absolutely, and you've done a good job already. We're a national nonprofit conservation organization. We were founded in 1947, originally as defenders of fur bearers, and have spent a lot of time throughout our history working to protect carnivores like wolves and grizzly bears, polar bears, bobcats, lynx, jaguar. But our mission has moved well beyond that to the protection of all native biodiversity and the habitats on which they depend. So we work a lot with the Endangered Species Act and with other federal laws in the United States to make sure that our public lands are managed both for wildlife and for people, and that species that require protection get it, and that they don't go extinct on our watch.
Mm-hmm. Over the course of 80 years, your organization, you mentioned, has worked in protecting different species and endangered species. And now you are focusing on restoring the biodiversity and protecting it. So the effects of climate change, so the environment that we have is sustainable, not getting extinct and endangering from day to day. So I applaud you for that wonderful mission that you and your organization have. What are some of the reasons that species and their habitats become endangered or imperiled?
Sure. Maybe just to back up a little bit, last year when the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services released a report saying that we could lose up to 1 million species in the next decade or two, I think alarm bells went off for many people around the world. In the United States, we passed in 1973 the Endangered Species Act out of recognition that we were already beginning to lose quite a bit of our native fauna and flora. And since then, the Act has been very successful in protecting species once they get on the list. We have had very few go extinct once they've been put on the list, but there are still far too many that are awaiting protection. And the Act generally focuses on individual species. It does have protections for habitat, but it doesn't take as broad an ecosystemic look at the biodiversity crisis as perhaps the next generation of environmental law might do. But basically, we have, I think biodiversity has a right to exist in and of itself, but it also provides so many benefits for people. And plants in particular, from the medicines that we use to just the ability to go out into the wild and to watch wildlife. There's for healthy ecosystem functioning, and also for the climate, because intact habitats provide not only carbon sequestration but also the ability for adaptation as climate changes. Wildlife is going to be moving increasingly from existing habitats to new habitats. And we need to make sure that as we're addressing all of these crises at once, that we have protected enough areas that they still have a chance to thrive.
Mm-hmm. Wow, million species becoming extinct in the next 10 years. That's you mentioned it's alarming statistics, and it brings a lot of attention to the cause and the reasons why species become extinct and why we need to protect them. And the fact that U.S. has a law in place, you mentioned Endangered Species Act, that has been there from 1970s, and it has been effective to an extent in protecting is important. But you mentioned that species, when they become a part of the list of endangered species, then the work begins. What does that work include?
That's a great question. Once a species is identified as needing federal protection, there's a process that you go through to try to get it listed, and it's listed as either threatened or endangered. Once that occurs, then it becomes illegal to hunt it, to shoot it, to capture it, to trade in species parts, because the Endangered Species Act also implements an international treaty called the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. So that helps to protect, wildlife from overexploitation. And then there are other resources that come to bear to protect species. So they can develop a scientifically based recovery plan that looks at what does a species need. We can adopt what's called critical habitat, which is a designation of areas that the species is likely to require, that's essential to its survival. And we can target conservation resources to everything from land acquisition to private stewardship, to reintroduction if necessary, moving species into good habitat so that they have a chance to expand their range. So it really marshals all of the resources of the federal government and also provides resources to state governments to make targeted approaches for each species. And that will vary from species to species depending on what they need.
Mm. It's important once they become a part of the list of endangered species according to Endangered Species Acts, then federal spending goes into the protecting those endangered species. You mentioned they are laws that prohibit people from hunting or from taking in the gardens some part of plants. But you mentioned that because of the federal spending sponsorship, they are reasons where new habitats are created, new places for them, new species where they can explore and become more and feel into safe environment. Could you please describe some of the recent work that your organization did in terms of protecting a particular kinds of species and why it was important to protect that particular species?
Sure. Well, habitat loss is one of the number one drivers of species extinction, both in the United States and around the world. And one of the projects that we have just started focusing on is something called 30 by 30. And it's a campaign to protect 30% of United States land and waters by 2030. And there's even a vision to protect up to 50% of land and water by 2050. And this really flows from the work of the biologist E.O. Wilson, who wrote a book called Half Earth, and has long been promoting the idea that if we're going to save biodiversity around the world, we need to stop the destruction of habitats, whether it's in the United States or in the rainforests or wherever there's still places where species can live. So that's a project that we are working on. We have also focused a lot on areas like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to try to stop drilling there, which would impact a number of native species and dramatically transform that environment. And we've worked on smaller areas too. Like I was involved in work to protect a little bird called the piping plover, as well as nesting sea turtles along the beaches of Cape Hatteras National Seashore. And what was happening there was the seashore was allowing vehicles to drive on the beach for camping and sport fishing and that sort of thing. And they weren't making any attempt to regulate those activities. So we went in and pointed out that wildlife populations were crashing at the seashore and managed to work out a regulation that limits the number of vehicles on the beach. And we've seen increases in nesting shorebird populations and sea turtle populations as well in that area. So, for individual species, it may be protecting specific habitats. And more broadly, it could be a campaign like 30 by 30, where we're really looking at, comprehensive ecosystem protection that will benefit all species, both endangered and the ones that are not yet endangered. And the best time to conserve a species is before it gets to be threatened. So our work really does cover the gamut.
Yeah, you mentioned several projects that you have worked in, and the fact that you were able to put legislation and to put action in place, and the results have been very positive based on the last example and you shared. But you also are focusing on the long-term plans, sustainable plans. You mentioned the Project 2030, the Project 2050. So not seeing a short-term solutions, but focusing on long-term solutions is important as well. And you highlighted the importance of protecting natural habitats and in the species in general before they become endangered. How do you make sure that you are protecting a species before they become endangered? What are some of actions that individuals, such me, or organizations that work on a higher level like yours and the government can do?
Sure. Part of the work that we do is really educational as well, and just reminding people about the benefits of biodiversity and encouraging sustainable use of land. When we start to realize that a species may be on its way to threatened or endangered status, there are mechanisms called candidate conservation agreements that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will sometimes put in place, and they're often voluntary agreements with private landowners to encourage them to take actions on their land that support or maintain habitat for those species. Habitat conservation planning generally is something else that can be put in place once a species is listed that can affect multiple species at once and try to come up with a more holistic way of using land. But in the United States, and this may be true elsewhere too, a lot of ordinary management of species is done by states and local governments. So it's really important that those entities as well take a broader approach to where development happens, what particularly important areas are protected, and shield them from development as much as possible, so that we still have connections between natural areas for species to migrate, to adapt, and to thrive. It's a lot of work. It takes a lot of different actors, from both just personal forbearance and interest in the issue to government policy, from local government all the way up to the federal government, to ensure that this is in fact a priority, and that we don't continue to lose species at the rate that we've been losing them in the past 50 years.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Raising awareness is always the first key, the first step into bringing attention and taking action. For instance, people might not know why the extinctions of particular species is dangerous for them, as for us, the humans. But when through educational campaigns that your organization does, we are educated on why it is important to protect them and how their extinction is affecting our lives, then as we as humans are attaching to the emotions, we tend to take actions when we feel that not some other species but ours, we ourselves are endangered. You mentioned, but that it's very important to take on action on the legislative level, especially on the not federal as federal, but state level actions, state level legislations to protect wildlife and species in general. And in United States, there are 50 states. How are states how are they managing the process of protecting wildlife, and is this a priority for them, for many states across the United States?
That's a really good question. And the answer is it really varies from state to state. There are some states that have their own versions of the Endangered Species Act that can be really quite effective. And then there are others that do not. In Virginia, where I live, just right outside of Washington, D.C., I've been working with our state government to develop a plan for protecting migratory birds and ensuring that new developments are conscious of impacts to migratory birds at the planning stage. So that's a really great example of something that a state is doing that could have really good benefits for wildlife. California and Massachusetts have been also doing a great job, and they have laws that support some of that. But at the same time, the state of Idaho has recently announced its own legislation to significantly reduce the wolf population in that state. And the state of Wisconsin held a wolf hunt earlier this spring that wiped out a couple hundred wolves and well in excess of even what they had intended to authorize. So we continue to face a lot of issues with coexistence with wildlife, with states that may not have the same goals that others may have, and that is definitely an issue that we continue to work on. So we try to advocate to some degree at the state level as well as at the federal level, and try to make sure that policies that are put in place locally are contributing to healthy wildlife populations and not moving in the wrong direction.
Mm-hmm. Some states are being pioneers while other states are being behind, and instead of taking care, they're actually putting species in danger. You mentioned on the wolf population in Wisconsin and Idaho. So some states can learn from pioneer states such as Virginia and Washington State and Oregon, where they have very wildlife-friendly legislation and protect actually species and wildlife in general. How do you see the landscape of the wildlife protection and species protection developing as in the next 4 years with the new administration in United States?
Well, I think we have a real opportunity. As you know, the last 4 years were kind of a difficult time for pushing environmental issues, and the political scene both in Washington and around the country is still very divided. And unfortunately, the environment has sort of gotten caught up in some of these sort of culture war issues that we see playing out in our political arena. That being said, the Biden administration has committed itself to the 30 by 30 plan that I mentioned before to try to protect 30% of our wildlife habitat and also waters as well. And they have put in place a number of people across the government that really do have an interest in environmental protection. So if they take kind of a whole of government approach to this, there's a lot that can be done to both address the climate crisis as well as the biodiversity crisis. The first step is undoing some of the bad policies that we saw in the last administration, and then moving forward, if we can, with bolder policies that will try to address these crises going forward. And then on the global stage, we have recommitted to the Paris Agreement. COP26 is coming up this year. We really need to see leadership all across the board, not just in the United States, but around the world on these issues, if we're going to address these global crises. But at least right now, I feel like the United States is moving in the right direction, and that the signals that the Biden administration, which is only 100 days old, have sent are positive and moving in the right direction for addressing these.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's definitely a good signal that United States is moving to the right direction in terms of environmental law and protecting environment and wildlife and species in general. If someone would like to support Defenders of Wildlife, how can they do that?
Well, we'd love to have their support, and they're welcome to go online to defenders.org, defenders.org, and check out our website. There's a place to donate there. And we would be delighted to welcome anyone who'd like to support our mission.
Mm-hmm. The link to the Defenders of Wildlife website will be provided in the description. So you viewing or listening, if you'd like to learn more about the great work Jason and his team are doing, you can go to defenders.org and familiarize yourself with the work. And if you would want to make financial contribution, you can do that by clicking the donate button. Thank you so much, Jason. It was wonderful to get to know you and the great work your organization is doing.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
For you listening, if you enjoyed this conversation, please press like and share button because this will show the YouTube and podcast algorithm that this conversation is important, that protecting natural species and their habitats is very important for protecting the biodiversity and sustaining environment. Thank you and see you in the next episode.